So I want to talk about React, the new context API, and how I bind and connect forms using this. So yeah, the React context API, I don't know, are here actually React guys or 1, 2, 3, 4, like, okay, React is a framework, like, no, kidding. So I hope you know what React is. If you don't know what's the context API, I guess I need Wi-Fi. So what's when you work with React, when you have component C, B, A, and you want that C does have some property, then you need to pass it all along. So if you render A renders B, and B renders C, and C is a text, then you have to pass it all along. Every time you want the properties go deep down, you need to pass them the component tree. And what the React Context API is, it helps you to connect to the provided value, so that you don't have to pass all your properties down. So you have just like you provide some value, like say hi, and then you only have to render A. And A doesn't have to know anything about the properties that are rendered by C. So you can render A, you can render C and B, and only the C is interested in some value that comes from a provided context. That makes sense when you have, for example, a theme provider where you provide some color, and you don't want to pass the color down the component tree, you just want to have the color at some background image. So what React gives you is this create context API, and it will give you a provider and a consumer. So a provider is where you put your data in, and then you have some nested component where you can use your consumer to pull out the data from the provider. And what create context actually does, it doesn't create a context for you. That's a lie, I guess. It doesn't create a context like creates an element. It creates like something like a factory that will create a context. So as soon as you mount your provider, or as soon as you render a provider, that's a component, by the way. Provider and consumer are both components. As soon as you render it, you create a context. So it's not one global context everywhere. It's just as soon as you render your provider, you are creating a context. And then somewhere deep down in the tree, when you have your consumer, and then the consumer uses the value of the closest parent provider. So even if you have like 2 or 3 descending providers, the consumer will take only the closest one. So I was thinking that would make sense to make something like a middleware, where you consume and again provide, and then consume and provide. And this is how this would look like. So you have a provider that provides the value ViennaJs. And if you pass it, if you render a consumer, then the consumer works with works that you need to pass children function as a child. And it will call this value. So ViennaJs will be called, and then what you could do is pass in again a provider, prefix the value, and then you could consume it again. So that was my idea how you could create a middleware. And from this on, I came to the idea that it would make sense to, when you are building forms, then most of the time the forms, I don't know if you know Formic or other form libraries, they provide the validation directly in the form, or they put it into the fields. And I wanted to make it decoupled, so I was thinking, how can I decouple validation from the actual form, so that the form, that the container of your data and of your update functions doesn't have to know anything about validation at all. And you could do something, I guess it's what I wanted to do right now. So, for example, I have this meetup and a meetup header. So you see that the meetup header doesn't use any value, you don't pass anything there. Instead it should do, it should consume the value from the provider. And what I did here was creating first the context, so the provider and consumer. And then I made a helper higher order component, which when it's called with a wrapper component, then I can directly pass the value to the wrapped component. Here's the value. It should be an object as defined here, but don't do this in practice. It's not a good practice. But still, you have your meetup header. I named this one with an underscore. You can name it however you want, but in React and with context API, you should always name your build your components that they are available also without any context or something. So this way they can be perfectly tested. And then you can connect it. Maybe you know this kind of connection from Redux. It's a similar approach, but much easier, right? Redux is a little bit more complex, but this one, through the new context API, it makes it a lot easier. So I connect it, and as soon as I connect it, I pass it the current value of its current provider. And I named this meetup, I created this meetup thing, which is essentially a provider which provides the name field. So as soon as you run this, you should get this ViennaJs thing. And as soon as you do something like React Vienna, which I unfortunately missed yesterday, you should be able to see that even though we have two different contexts, we can access them based on the fact, based on the nearest provider. So at the React page, docs page, they are writing like, you should not use it for local data, you should use it for global data. I don't care in this case. It works. So I don't know if there are any problems with it, but it works. And you can use it the same way with forms. What I wanted to say about the middleware is you could, when you have something like this is the same thing I was talking about here. So you have this consumer, provider, consumer thing. And if I take this from here and call it a prefix, then I could prefix with hello. And it would work. So this you completely decoupled the meetup header from the meetup and added some middleware behavior that change the flow. And that's the same idea how I was thinking about creating a forms library. So I call it React Formula. It's some experimental way of building React forms. It's currently on GitHub, and it's an experimental approach. And all it does gives you some higher order components where you can build your bound forms. Actually, you have to pronunciate it like React Formular, so it sounds a little bit more Viennese. It's a Viennese open source library that's very experimental. So there's this validation as middleware approach. It should be minimalistic, and it has only like this few functions. Provide formula gives you the ability to create a context with a form, and then you have something like with form field or with form higher order component. And there's also a test here where I create this provide formula and give it a string. You could give it a component. It's a higher order component, so you could put in whatever you like, and it will create a context for all descending children. Then I made a simple form. It's just an input. You can also add here any component you like, and it's a shorthand for what happens when the value updates. And then we have this form which where you pass some initial data, and the simple form field, because of the names with form field, you are binding it with a string, and you have also the possibility to make it with selectors. So what happens here is when I add it here, it's like a form from Formular. Nice. Nice. So currently, when you look at the example implementation of the sample field, then the update happens via onChange. That's what I was thinking first. And of course, you might say, yeah, well, when I start writing, I will get every change. So maybe a lot of people would say that's not what I want, because if you have a big form, this might be a problem. Then I would say, okay, maybe I have to do something like on blur and make it accessible to all kinds of ways. But it's actually it's up to you how you would build this, because I have when you see at this with form, then the implementation with form field is just something like when you can bind it to a field, but you can build your own with form component based on the whole data. So you could do whatever you like. But in my case, I just wanted to play around with this middleware approach, where I now have something like debounce. And when you say debounce and wait, let's give it a number. How's the time? I don't know. So as we did not change anything about the form or the simple field, they are completely decoupled, and we built a middleware, and as soon as you start writing something, it's now debounced and not, yeah, it doesn't change all the time. Of course, it's not perfect. It's directly here. You could put many fields into it, and they would change all in a debounced way. No. Yeah, I saw this one time already. So yeah, it's the same way with, and it's a decoupled way. So you have the ability to put as many middlewares as you like, and the simple field doesn't know what the form is. It's just calling the function that is passed down, and the middleware. I could check one more time how the middleware works. It just takes this use, and you can intercept it and change the values as you like. Of course, it's necessary that while you are typing, the values should be still visible. It needs to have a draft where it updates all the time, so that controlled components are that the changes are visible as soon as possible, but the actual data is then called anytime when the middleware decides. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I guess thanks. Well, to the why, because I was asking Jan to brainstorm with him, but he's a really busy guy. He said to me, well, forms for me are solved, right? Yeah, and you're absolutely right. There's Formic, there's React Forms, there's React Redux. There are so many forms, but you know, I just wanted to play around with it and try. How would it be if you have a decoupled way of validation, or decoupled anything? Well, this middleware approach gives you a lot of possibilities. I don't know if it's actually useful, but this debounce thing, this validation thing, and maybe some authentication middleware could be quite interesting, where you allow the user to edit only a few things. And yes, now is the thanks. Okay.